Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers of the seminar and the Commander for inviting me. As always, it's a huge pleasure for me to be here with all of you. But before I go into the slides, so like the other presenters, I've tried to interpret security in as broad a context as possible so that we can discuss as wide an array of issues as possible. So I've tried to mix in both traditional and non-traditional security threats. So these are, in my judgment, the four major factors. So if we were to take the landscape metaphor literally, these are, in my judgment, the factors that would determine how bumpy or chaotic the terrain is. So geopolitical, technological, environmental, and of course non-state actors. So under geopolitical factors, what I would be looking at are state rivalries, territorial issues, and things like that. Under technological factors, new domains of warfare, which are particularly relevant for South Asia, and emerging technology. As far as environmental factors go, of course, climate change is extremely important and a big part of any discourse on environmental security, and South Asia is no different. And I will also be touching on things like food security and water security. And finally, non-state actors. Of course, terrorism is the major issue there, but I will also be touching on things like trafficking. Right, first, as far as geopolitical factors are concerned, now, of course, the dominant relationship or rivalry, however we wish to phrase it, that determines South Asian security from a state-to-state perspective, one could argue, is India-Pakistan. Now, as all of us know, we are in the midst of interesting times in terms of the Indo-Pak relationship, particularly with India's amendment of Article 370 of its constitution, the Balakot incident which happened earlier this year, which was really a paradigm shift, because when India and Pakistan successfully conducted nuclear tests on May 1998, it almost seemed like the prevailing wisdom that a conventional warfare exchange between the two countries should not happen, cannot happen, will not happen. But what we can tell from the Balakot incident is that there was, aerial firepower being exchanged by both sides, not only in contested territory, which would have been interesting in itself, but in proper mainland Pakistan, for example, right? So that was a huge paradigm shift, and in that sense, we are also living in a sort of, I suppose one could call almost a new era of defense and security policy for India, India being one of the major determinants of how South Asian security plays out. So it almost seems as if in the last 5 or 6 years, particularly with the BJP government coming to power, India is consciously practicing a more robust, more muscular foreign policy, so to speak, and that will of course have repercussions for the entire region. Prime Minister Modi's Sagar doctrine is quite interesting, security and growth for all in the region. It's in many ways a departure from, I suppose, traditional Indian foreign policy, and in the Q&A session perhaps we could have a discussion on what the exact consequences would be. The India-China relationship, of course, is also important. Now one could argue that China is not really in South Asia, but China is right at the doorstep of South Asia, and China is a global power, so it has to be discussed. India and China, of course, have several territorial issues that are still unsorted, Arunachal Pradesh, for example, being one of them. 2 years ago, there was the Doklam standoff between the two, which in some senses one could argue was also a paradigm shift, because the Indian establishment essentially stood up to the Chinese establishment, and that was perhaps something that a lot of people were not expecting. Ultimately, the balance of power game that India and China have to play with each other, whether they like it or not, because they're neighbors, this will affect South Asian security as a whole. Of course, now it's not just the India-China rivalry that will dictate South Asian security, but the Pakistan-China friendship is a very important factor as well, and particularly because of things like the CPEC economic corridor and things like that, because India is perhaps the only real key player that has not really come on board the BRI vision. And CPEC being a part of the BRI vision, that will have political sort of consequences for the rest of the region as well. Outside of this triangle between India, Pakistan and China, of course now, at the onset, let me just say that these things are not by any means meant to be an exhaustive list of every single security problem in the South Asian region. What I've tried to do in the presentation is provide a snapshot of what the terrain looks like. So about 3 weeks ago, the 8th round of talks between the United States and the Taliban was concluded. Some are optimistic, some are pessimistic, some feel that it's inevitable that peace will now come through engagement with the Taliban. Some seem to be quite suspicious of whether the Taliban can be trusted to keep their word. Does this mean that there's some kind of American-Pakistan deal that will happen? Are we looking at a sort of rushed withdrawal of American troops because of the 2020 presidential elections that are coming up in the United States? There are many unanswered questions around it. And finally, of course, as most of you would know, politics in the Indian Ocean will have a huge impact on South Asian security calculations. Of course, the power game in the Indian Ocean is much bigger than simply the South Asian sort of competitive field. But whatever happens there, because every major power is interested in the Indian Ocean, and what will happen there will have consequences as well. Technological factors. So, space warfare and cyber warfare, to a certain extent, I suppose we could call new domains. Now, space is very interesting in the South Asian context because, so earlier in March, if I'm not mistaken, India successfully demonstrated anti-satellite technology. And this once again is big news because now, just as how something like nuclear technology dictated the military hierarchy of the second half of the 20th century, it's quite possible, and in my judgment, it's inevitable, that new forms of technology, particularly domains like space warfare, will determine what the military hierarchy of the 21st century will be. And I mean, maybe we have to wait for a 9/11 moment or a Hiroshima moment or however we wish to phrase it, but when the power of space technology, of militarized space technology becomes visible, just as how the power of nuclear technology became visible with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks, I think we will see a realignment of the military hierarchy, and India has already gone ahead. This has of course prompted Pakistan and Russia to sign a space pact. It was signed in May earlier this year. We can once again in the Q&A session get into what the repercussions of that could be, because Russia is a close partner of India in terms of space initiatives, but on the commercial side. Whereas the pact between Russia and Pakistan is essentially one that says that they will be partners in preventing the militarization of outer space. So there are different consequences that come with that. So to a certain extent, you could say that South Asia is already the battlefield for a space race. As far as the cyber domain is concerned, I would call South Asia an extremely attack-prone region, both in terms of attacks from state to state and in terms of cyber crimes and cyber theft and things like that. Social media has been a huge problem. It is a problem in almost every part of the world, there's no doubt about it. But from a security perspective, in South Asia, it seems to present a few interesting challenges, because the first thing it does clearly is it takes the ability to be the sole creator of a narrative away from the state, and it gives it to non-state actors and citizens as well. In South Asia, we also have a large English-speaking population. So outside of the Western world, we have one of the largest English-speaking populations. So what happens when you give all of us access to social media is that, once again, we tend to get a lot more exposed to what's going on, a lot more exposed to external information. And sometimes you might have access to information through technology, but you might not have access through language. So in South Asia, we now have both, and that is a challenge for states. It's being used as a tool for recruitment, as most of you would already know, by non-state actors, particularly terrorist organizations. And it's also become a problem for public order, particularly in times of crisis. How do we stop fake rumors from being spread? How do we stop this from becoming a hazard to the law and order of a country? And there doesn't really seem to be any conclusive answer. Different countries seem to have tried different things, but together we will have to eventually find an answer, because these things will become inevitable problems. Finally, we have other bits of emerging technology as well, like unmanned vehicles or drones. For example, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we all have pretty tight restrictions on unlicensed usage of unmanned vehicles, of drones. However, all our countries are also finding it to be quite a huge challenge to implement this, to ensure that this does not become a threat to the rest of the population. Environmental factors, now this is where some of these sort of non-traditional aspects come in. Of course, climate change is a big problem because of it can create population disruptions, it can create famine, it can create a whole host of problems for states. It can disrupt your agriculture because of the influence of salt and things like that when sea levels rise. The biggest existential threat, though, of course, out of all these South Asian nations, Bangladesh has a lot to lose, but in terms of an actual existential threat, the Maldives is termed by some to be what's called an Atlantis state. Essentially what that means is a state that will probably be submerged by the second half of the 21st century if rising sea levels are not curbed. So not only is climate change an economic, security, social problem for us, it also presents us with an existential crisis in some states. Cyclones have always been a major problem, and here again is where humanitarian intervention and the readiness of the armed forces to respond to a humanitarian crisis or a disaster or something like that becomes very important. Just this year we had Cyclone Fani in India and Bangladesh, which killed almost 200 people and displaced over 1 million people. Now this is from one cyclone in the region which displaced over 1 million people in the space of one season. So clearly it is a devastating problem. Deforestation is a big issue. It's a big issue in Sri Lanka. It's a huge issue in Pakistan. The national coordinator of the SLMP, which is the Sustainable Land Management Program of the World Bank, the national coordinator in Pakistan made a statement recently that if this is not curbed, if deforestation in Pakistan is not curbed, then by 2030 or 2040, in places like the Balochistan province, the Sindh province, and the Punjab province, we are looking at the chance of mass starvation as soon as 2035 or 2040. On the issue of water itself, as our keynote speaker mentioned, South Asia is one of the most vulnerable areas in terms of water shortage and conflict that could break out through wars, because we have lots of trans-boundary rivers. Right, so the upstream countries will claim that it's a matter of sovereignty, what they do with the diversion of the rivers. Downstream countries will claim that this is a sort of humanitarian affront and all that, so that needs to be navigated properly as well. Floods have been a major problem, so we are stuck between two extremes, right? Too much water and too little water. Water shortage might lead to war, but we also have floods. Just this year alone, this monsoon alone, in South Asia, over 660 people have died and over 6 million people have been displaced, right? So once again, that the number of people displaced, this is on par with some of the sort of major historical wars that we've seen. 6 million people displaced is not a small sum. Finally, we also have diseases, so it's caused due to pollution, it's caused due to lack of awareness. HIV is a big problem, infectious diseases are a big problem. Perhaps, as our keynote speaker mentioned, it might just be an inevitable part of developing countries sort of climbing up the ladder. In terms of something like polio, for example, right? So Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria are the only 3 countries in the entire world where polio is still endemic. So 2 out of the only 3 countries in the entire world where something like polio is endemic, that fall, both of them are in South Asia. So diseases are a major problem as well. And finally, we come to the role of non-state actors. Terrorism is the major thing. One analogy I always like to use is the franchise model, or the sort of McDonald's model. So just as how there would be a head office which then franchises its brand name to other parts of the world, and they might provide a certain amount of support and encouragement and things like that. It's up to the local franchisee to sort of make what they will of it. So we're starting to see that trans-boundary nature of terrorism becoming a huge problem. Terrorism also thrives on a polarization of communities, which once again in South Asia, which is even by global standards extremely multi-ethnic, even by global standards extremely multi-religious, multi-racial. this becomes a big problem, because terrorism thrives on splitting us apart in order for sort of their roots to be established. Technology plays a huge role as well, in the sense that with modern technological gimmicks and gadgets, one person is now capable of wreaking a lot more havoc and destruction than ever before in human history. Right, so that is a major challenge. Human trafficking is a huge problem. It's estimated that about 150,000 people are affected every year in South Asia because of human trafficking. Nepal is the worst affected out of the lot. You could also look at the perhaps Rohingya refugees and claim that you could add that as well. Some people, for whatever reason, don't like including Myanmar as part of South Asia, but I'm completely opposed to that. I think Myanmar is an integral part of South Asia for various historical reasons as well. So if we include that, it would be an even bigger number that's affected every year in South Asia by human trafficking. Drug trafficking is also another problem. I think some of the other presenters mentioned that as well. South Asia is once again in a weird position, because we are between the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle, or at least both run through South Asia. So the Golden Triangle, as you all know, is Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar. And the Golden Crescent is Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. So these are the two major drug producing regions in Asia. And both border South Asia. Many countries are used as transit points, and as the sort of drug boom in Southeast Asia becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, as is what's happening now in Southeast Asia, we will feel the ripple effects of it, and there is no way that sort of South Asian security, particularly from a drug trafficking point of view, can insulate itself from the drug boom in Southeast Asia. Finally, I mean, they are not harmful non-state actors, but I've just put in refugees there because I need to fit them in somewhere. Right? There are about 2 to 2.5 million refugees in South Asia. Once again, this is excluding the Rohingya. So there are another about 1 million to 1.2 million Rohingya refugees as well, which takes the entire refugee population to about 3.5 million. Right? What do we do? There are many challenges that we face, because many states are worried that these refugees might come with sort of certain ideological sort of agents who sort of permeate through the refugee masses. With the Rohingya refugees, for example, many states quite honestly seem to be hesitant to sort of take them in because they are worried about the Rohingya Salvation Army's presence in many of these sort of refugee masses. So this is, as I was saying earlier, just meant to be a snapshot of the various traditional and non-traditional security threats that I think will challenge the South Asian security landscape here. In terms of whether we go for cooperation or conflict, I echo the sentiments of the previous speakers that there must be cooperation and that must be our ultimate goal. However, I am not a sort of globalist by any nature. I'm also a big believer in sovereignty, and I think for countries in South Asia, perhaps many of our problems would be solved if we just took our sovereignty more seriously and if we were willing to stand up for our sovereignty. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.